My name is Dean Solinsky. I'm a retired forester, or I want to be retired, but I'm the only one left. I was born in Berkeley, California, in a little hospital that's no longer there on WWII. It was September 21, 1921. I was an infant, and my family lived in Berkeley and Piedmont at the time, and I spent my infant years I think in Piedmont or somewhere. But the family moved to Castella in Shasta County. I guess they were up there. My dad had a sawmill in Castella, and they were doing a logging, and the house was right on the Highway 101 where it is now. It was looking over the river, but it was just a cabin. And I had a brother and two sisters and a younger sister. And the two older sisters were taking care of me one day, and they were playing in the log pond. And I was sitting on one of those spools that holds the cable, and they looked around and I wasn't there. So they thought I better look, and so they went over, and there I was at the bottom of the pond, but I had just got there and I was safe. And when the Depression hit in 1928, it was the wisest thing my dad could do was to shut her down, and we moved down there and went down stayed in McCallum Hill for a while where my mother was born, and stayed in their old house, and then I went to Berkeley. But the reason I was up there in 1952, riding on a ridge overlooking the Sacramento River, and a guy in a pickup, he was a farmer or something, he said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, my name is Dean Solinsky." And he said, "Oh, that's Solinsky. They went broke, didn't they?" And that's when I found out he knew when the Depression hit that it was a tough time. And so then we moved to Berkeley, where my grandfather built the home in 1896. And then they lived in San Francisco, and so that's where the family lived, and that's where I was raised from the first grade on till I got out of first half of Cal. I went to McKinley Grammar School, LeConte Grammar School, when McKinley was condemned in the 1932 or so earthquake in Los Angeles. It was one of the few schools that weren't turned down. They just converted it to continuation high school. It's taking the kids out of there. And then I went to Willard Junior High, and then Berkeley High. And I graduated from Berkeley in December of 1939. I was in the odd year, and then so in 1940 in January 40, I enrolled at Cal, and was there for a year and a half because I had a bad leg, I couldn't get in the ROTC, but I could get in the Army. And so the Army saluted me and said, "We'll welcome you here." And I went down, and my fraternity thought I was the first one to go to that war, and we all had a party. But when I got to San Francisco, they said, "We don't want you." So I was back, and I spent that summer working in the woods at Winton Lumber Company. And then I was able to join then in September, and I didn't have a party this time. If you've ever been recruited and gone through the recruiting service, you know how they treat you. Well, they said, well, this sergeant said, what are you good at? And I said, well, I don't know. I don't know whether I'm good at anything, but I do have went to college. And he said, oh, they said, you have a year of chemistry, one chemistry 1A and 1B and Chem 10. You're going to go into the Chemical Warfare Service. And so the next thing I knew, I was on a Sunset Limited going to the South with $14 and a train ticket. $14 was $1 they allowed for each meal that they expected to have to have on the way there. And so I got to New Orleans, and I still had a few dollars left. My next flight was not flight, but train was a Louisville Northern or something of that sort. And I spent the last dollars I had getting a train ticket because my ticket was not good there. And so I arrived at this Camp Seibert. They told me it was a brand new school. And so they said, well, welcome here. And they said, well, first thing we got to do is dig a latrine. They handed me a shovel. That was how new it was. So that was a chemical warfare school. And I spent 3 months at the school when I was waiting to go to officer candidate, candidate school, and they needed people overseas, and I came back from guard duty, and our first sergeant was going like he waved, and I was on the train going west again that next morning. And when we went through Berkeley, so they saw how they stopped at the Berkeley station. A fraternity brother that knew me, and he knew I was gone, he called my dad and said, I just saw Dean going through Berkeley. And so my dad, who had been in the First World War, he had a sergeant, and he called and they said, Dean's on Angel Island. And so I just told the captain, I said I wanted to pass to go see my family at Berkeley, but they were waiting in San Francisco. And they said, no passes, you're going overseas. And the next thing you know, the phone rang again, and they called me up, and the captain said, if I knew General somebody, and I said, no. And he said, well, he wants to talk to you. And I picked up the phone, it was my dad, and he said, I said, I can't come because there's no passes. And the fellow that just denied it, the captain, he said, oh, yes, you can go. And so I did have that pass that night. I went in and saw my family and my girlfriend, and then we had a nice dinner at the Sir Francis Drake, and then I was off. The next day I went overseas. I got on this board ship, and it was one of the it wasn't a Liberty ship, it was one that was in foreign duty before, and the captain was a Dutch captain with a very guttural accent, and the crew were all Japanese, and here I was going to fight the Japanese in the war, and we had a German captain and a Japanese crew, I thought. And they say, now hear this, or something in the German accent. And I got on board, and we were down waiting for the ship out, move. And this lieutenant came by, and he said, you guys are on the port gun now. And they sent us up. They had Navy gunners, but they didn't have to stand route guard until they were called on. So we were up there, but we loved it because this Coda Goen was the name of the ship, which is a Dutch banana boat. And it was rough, and everybody got sick, and they were down in the lower bunkers, 3 high, bunk. And it was very miserable down there. So I stayed up in the gun nest the whole trip to Hawaii. And we did get to shoot the gun once. Javanese instead of Japanese. And they looked like Japanese. Well, Javanese looked Oriental. And so that's what, and we got to Hawaii, and they sent us up to outside of Hickam Field, not Schofield Barracks, but they had a tent camp there for emergencies, and our boat had developed measles on the trip over, and we were put in quarantine. And so here we were. We're in Tent City looking out on the beautiful ocean and waited till we finally got clear of the measles, and then I was assigned to squadron. We were all assigned to our various, wherever we were headed. I was headed into a squadron. But at that time, every squadron was supposed to have a chemical warfare expert, which so 3 months training, I was an expert. And so that was the training squadron, and then I eventually got assigned to the 6th Night Fighter Squadron. The work we had lime to counteract mustard gas. We were all supposed to have capes that we protect them from the mustard gas. But we were mainly I think everybody had to have one. So they gave me a truck, though, and I got a promotion. At that time, going into an old squadron, the 6th Night Fighter Squadron was established in World War I, and it had an MOS that limited the number of rates they had, and there were a whole bunch of sergeants in the squadron who were on the boat ready to go back when Pearl Harbor hit. So they were still there, and they loved the beer garden and smoked cigars and ate onions, and that's where that one picture. Anyway, I'm getting away from myself. So my duties with the squadron was I gave lectures on chemical warfare, and also demonstrated decontamination, how we do it. And so then my name became Deacon. They called me Deacon Solinsky, some of the guys. And I would get them out and I'd train them, but we didn't actually. We had a spray gun, but we'd fill it with water and just spray water. And this went on for a while. But I also got sergeant stripes way ahead of schedule because I was supposed to have it after. That's what the MOS said, and so they made me a sergeant. That was where I ended up. And so now we were at Kapapa Gulch is where I ended up, and it was built out of a cane field, and it was about 30 miles from Honolulu, and that's where that's where our planes would fly. We had all mixture of 6th Night Fighter Squadron was a ragtag plane, and we had planes from 1938. 35, no, we had all the old ones, no modern ones, but then we had some P-70s, which was a converted A-20 into a radar. Had a radar man in the back and fixed guns and a pilot. That was a two-man crew. And so that was my first airplane ride in one of those. It was a gunnery practice, and they were shooting at aerial towed targets, and then also on the ground strafing. And this pilot, he's a big, tall, blonde Texan. He got out of the plane, and reached over the bomb bay and pulled some palm trees leaves out of the tree. He said, I guess I was a little bit close, and here I was waiting because I was supposed to ride in the back that next flight and with the tow target and release it at a certain time. But that was my first ride, and I really enjoyed it. And this went on for about a year and a half, and when we got some new airplanes, the P-61 came. It was a P-61B. We were the first squadron to get these planes, the P-61 night fighter, built especially for night fighting. And so we were destined to go out. We didn't know where we were going, and but they were just taking a small detachment, and I wanted to go. I didn't want to stay around Honolulu anymore. That was a nice place, and so I was a part of an 85-man detachment that we were sent out, and we got on the board ship and sailed along, and we didn't know where we were going. We knew we were going west, which is where the Japanese were, headed that way, and about 3 weeks out, they had a bulletin board on how they have on the ship, and it said Americans and Normandy invasion, and we were going the wrong way for that invasion, but there it was going on. That was when the November or June 6th is when that started, and we were headed. We were a day ahead of them by then. We went across the date line, and so it was actually June 7th for us, but it was the same time. And then that's when we found out we were going to the Marianas, and they had all kinds of literature, and don't eat the food, because it's all night earth, which is human waste goes on night earth. That's what all the Japanese use, and so we got near Saipan, and we found out we were going to Saipan, and we turned around, went back to Eniwetok where we were waiting. We still on board ship, but that was when they had the Battle of the Philippines, the air battle, and they didn't want any people like we were. We might have been, so we went back, and so it was about 6 days after the invasion that we went aboard. We climbed down a rope ladder just like they do in the movies, and we went and got up to our airfield. It was the Aslito airfield, the Japanese plane built, and it was a little over a half-mile long, the runway, and it was a slope in the middle. So if you sat in your plane at one end, you couldn't see the plane on the other end. There was just a mound between you. But that's what our planes were using. And so when Saipan was getting secured, the Battle of Tinian started. And Tinian was the adjoining island of Saipan on the Marianas, and where we were on the south end of the island, I guess the north end, we could look over and see Tinian. And so our squadron was not involved. We were a night fighter squadron, but we did have 3 fighter squadrons, P-37, P-47, and that was what they used for the. So we could see them take off from our field and fly around. We could still circling around, and saw them drop their bombs on Tinian. We had a roadside, beautiful position to see the war going on, and I'll remember this. We had a radio and for the airplanes, and where they were using that guy to show the targets. And I remember this guy coming out, and he said, "Give that man a cigar." And that's what I remember. The pilot he was telling how made us bullseye. And so after about a year on Saipan, the island was secured, and we were, I would say we were exhausted. We were a worn out crew because we were just a small detachment, and they said, we're sending you back to Hawaii because we still got to go to Japan. So I've been sort of fortunate all my war experience. I was held back because I had become, when we landed on Saipan, my officer said, "We don't need a chemical warfare man. You're the new supply sergeant." So I was the supply sergeant, but when we were on the island, and I was held back to get rid of all our equipment. We just dumped it in the ocean, and so I flew back to Hawaii. All the squadron, the rest of them were on a slow boat to China, but they were going the other way. And so then this was getting near the end of the war. They said, you can have a rest and relaxation, R&R. And so they sent 5 of us over to the island of Hawaii and had tickets to it was the Kilauea, was where they had the rest for the people coming back from down below. And so we decided we wouldn't go there, but we got a motel in Hilo, and we just rented a Model A, and that's where how we enjoyed our 5 days. And then they started dropping the bomb in August. This was in July of 45 when we had this rest period, and we went to. We were I guess there was one little more experience. This friend of mine who was the crew chief of this plane up here, and he had a buddy that was on the carrier Saratoga, and I had my brother's brother-in-law. His Betty's brother was an admiral or captain then, naval captain with a squadron, but they happened to be not there when we went up to looking for him after the morning celebration stopped, and we got on the ship. We talked to when we got on these carriers. We were just sergeants, but they recognized we had good friends, and so they gave us a tour of the 2 carriers, and then the pilots were all fresh from the United States, and they were mad because the war was ended and they didn't get to fire one shot in their airplane. And we were told them it wasn't worth waiting for or whatever. So then the war really ended, and I went back to the United States. And when we got back to the United States, my family had moved. My mother and father had moved from McCallum Hill. Moved from, I should say, Berkeley to a home that they had in McCallum Hill, and what my dad had refurbished before the war. And I had never been there, but that's where they lived then in 1945. And I got home, and while I was overseas, excuse me, I had a girlfriend named Charmian, who we became engaged before I left to overseas, and we got married 2 weeks after I got back. And I went to a honeymoon down in Pebble Beach, and we stayed at the Pebble Beach Hotel, and it was not cheaper then. And we had a whole week, and then we went to Canary. Our little house next to the clubhouse of Pebble Beach was called the Canary Cottage, and we had that. And then after a week, we went to south of Carmel, just a short ways, and for one night, and then I came back, and my brother was, in the meanwhile, was cruising redwoods down in Santa Cruz. And when I got back from my honeymoon, I suddenly found I was running compass for my brother down in Santa Cruz. My brother, Frank J. Solinsky III, was a timber cruiser and forester and really an all-the-time expert in other things, but he was an English major in college, but he had been, he's 12 years older, and he had been working as a forester and a timber estimator. And so he was down cruising in this redwood timber in Santa Cruz, owned by the Wells Fargo Bank, and there was a trust and the Santa Cruz Lumber Company had a cutting contract on it. And he was cruising this to finalize this deal with the Santa Cruz and between the bank and Santa Cruz. And so we were cruising the Redwood, and he had a partner who was not a forest, but an old timer. He had been his compassman for a long time, and so I just fit in, and I became the compassman, and the other, Lumpy as we called him, became the tree measurer. And they were doing in pairs, and the other cruiser was Oscar Larson, who is famous to Eureka people. And Oscar had a fellow, Rudy Lawson, but they were not related, and we were running lines. This was in November of 1945, and it was short weeks, short days. And so we were cruising this redwood, and it was about a mile from the creek, Pescadero Creek, to the ridge. Actually, it was about a mile and a quarter. But we'd run up the hill and back down. That was our day's work. But by the time we got back down, it was getting dark, and my brother was he was very active, and he was an athlete, and so we had to run to get out before it got dark. And he dragged me. I was a retired, returning vet, and I thought was in good shape, but he had to pull me out to get me back to. So we were cruising that, and I'm telling you too much. This is the funny part. Oscar Larson was cruising too, and where they were staying at the Albion Hotel, when dark came, they closed the bar and then they closed their cafeteria. And so Oscar said, when I got there, he said, "Dean," he said, "we found a place for us that we can eat our dinner at the bar." And so we moved to the Troutmere. It was a summer resort, but they were closed for the winter, except they had the cook and the owner. They were very nice, and we had rooms, and we could have dinner when we got back from the woods. And this went on till about Christmas time when we finished the job. I was waiting to go back to school. I still had 2 years to go at Berkeley, and I was debating with myself whether I should go back and get a college degree after being out for 3 or 4 years, or to start working. I had jobs offered in the woods, but the others, my brother and my dad, were encouraging me to go back to school. But then Henry Thomas, who was a timber consultant from Portland, Oregon, who had been working with the family in California for a while, and he said, if you go back to school, you're going to be equal to whoever you work with. They're all going to be college graduates, and you're going to be a punk. And he said, go back and get your degree. And then he said, I also have a job for you right now. And so that's when I decided I'd go back, but it would be several months before I could go. And so that's when he offered me the job, and I went to work with this gentleman, and a retired U.S. Forest Service fellow, and he knew every region, every forest of the Region 6. He knew intimately what the timber was like, and so we'd get in his little car and we're going to cruise this area, this timber, this region, and he'd get out of his briefcase and he'd say, "Oh, this forest has this volume table," and he'd study it, and then he said, "Well, we'll use this one," and so we'd cruise that, and I was a compassman and tree measurer with him, and we went through several national forests. We also cruised one that Weyerhaeuser Timber was buying, and so we cruised that one too, and so that took me up into the summer of 1948, and we. But I learned a lot with this old fellow, and he was just a nice old man, and he's probably 60. I thought, he looked old to me. And then I went back with my brother. When I got back out of the Army, after my first stint in the cruising with the Redwoods, the South Grove of the Calaveras big trees which was owned by Pickering. They were going to sell it to the state, and Henry Thomas, our one, he had the job. My brother, both of them were cruising the South Grove, and we didn't cruise the redwood trees, the big trees, the gigantea. We were just cruising the whitewoods and pine and cedar. And so that was about 5,000 acres, and it's now a state park, beautiful state park. But we didn't count the big trees, and there are a lot of beautiful old big trees there. And right off of the Calaveras big trees, and then the South Grove is actually in Tuolumne County, but it's right next to Calaveras. And I spent the summer doing that, cruising this redwoods, and that was summer, and I went back to school after that. And I had another year and a half to go, and that's when I finished in February, and that's when I got into the working out up in the pines with this old gentleman. Yep. And also we got as our little company, my brother and I. He was the brains. The Stockton box had the Southern Pacific, Southern Pacific timber that was up in the Rubicon, which is on the American River, on the Rubicon, and it's a virgin stand of whitewoods and pine and whitewoods. They were interested in buying it, and Stockton Box was buying it from Southern Pacific Company, and so we were cruising that. I was the cruiser then, and my brother did not do it. He was at that time he was working part-time with Stockton Box as a consultant until he got better. His legs were still weak at the time. And when that was my next job, and that took me up to Christmas time. When I finished the job with the Southern Pacific Stockton Box job, I started doing work out of my home in McCallum Hill, and the Allen Estate had 6,000 acres across over in Amador County and El Dorado, and they wanted to cruise, and I started cruising there and mapping it. It was a nice property, and that was when the Forest Service and the state people used to chide me a little bit. They said, "You're making maps without all the fancy machinery." I had a compass, and we'd just, when we crossed the stream, we would say where we were, and then we'd draw a map from that, and without using any fancy gadgets. And they said, "How could you do it?" But they were using our map that we finally made for fire protection. It didn't tell you you're within a foot, but it would tell you where you were and the right county and the right road. So it worked out fine. It took us a couple of years to cruise it. We finished it and we mapped it. But I was doing that often when I didn't have the other jobs. Well, my dad always wanted me to get a degree, and he was what he called a timber factor. And he went to law school. He graduated from Golden Hastings College in San Francisco, but he went to Cal, but he got a law degree faster in 1906. So he was a lawyer, but he dealt in timber. He was raised in the country. His father, Frank Solinsky, the senior, was born in the Mother Lode also in 1856, and so, but he was a lawyer, but in those days, a mining lawyer was what they really were, because they were dealing in mine properties, and so, but he had a bunch of clients that had timber in Calaveras County. He didn't own it himself, but they acquired quite a bunch of timber, tied it up. And that's what my dad was doing. And he was finally, after 1906 to when the timber started getting accessible. The first part in Calaveras County, there was no railroad, and it was 1940. It was about the earliest they started cutting. I should say, my brother, who was a very active timber cruiser in 1945, he caught polio, and he was limited in his physical activity. So when I got out of school, it was almost a time where he needed legs and I had them. So that was when we formed our company, Frank Dean Solinsky, in February of 1948. But I worked for Henry Thomas's under the name of Frank Dean Solinsky. And then in 1950 is when I was getting to the the Redwood region had the logging congress in Eureka at the time. And my dad went to, he never went to a logging conference, but he went there and he had regional, the head of the Forest Service for Region 5, plus some fellow from Washington, D.C., and the state, and we sat at the head table. But this fellow from Washington was I can't remember his name, but we had a good time together. And that was the last time my dad ever went to one of those, and he died shortly thereafter. But I have to say I was a very fortunate young guy to get out of the service and have so many contacts of high, and it was, the private foresters were almost non-existent. They would work, go to school, and they'd come out and join the Forest Service or something. And so there wasn't the competition for me that I had. The newcomers didn't come until 20 years later, and but Oscar Larson was, I mentioned him. He was a forester, but he was also an engineer. He was a surveyor. And there were some old-time cruisers, but they were, and that was about all we had, but these old cruisers, but they was just an indication of what was there, they weren't accurate at all. I moved from McCallum Hill to Marin County in 1953-54, and I moved to Eureka in 1990. I did most of my work when I did up in Eureka was I'd drive up there or fly up. The Solinskys, the lawyer part of it, my grandfather had an office in the Hobart building, and before that was in another building. But in the Hobart building, till we moved out, my brother and I were the only ones left called Solinsky there. And we moved from the Hobart building down to North Bay. We was inch north to Marin. And this is another story. It's sort of cute if you don't have to tell it. But my grandfather had a secretary that followed. She was his secretary in 1896. And he moved to his office about 1903 or so. And she followed him shortly thereafter. She was a single woman, never married, and she became his secretary during the earthquake. And then when they moved to the Hobart building, she came right along, and she was, then when my brother and I formed our company, we had a room in the Hobart building. That was where we started, and Ella Potter was still pecking away, and she till I guess it was 1967 when we moved north and to Embarcadero Center and all. Not the Embarcadero Center, but out on the Embarcadero. And And she said, Dean, you can't move out there. That's not it doesn't have a lawyer's address. And I said, well, we're not lawyers. But she died after, that was our retirement programs. When you get to be 90, you die. And that's it. She wouldn't quit. We had younger people come in, but Ella was still doing her thing like this. And she was a secretary that had a desk worse than this, bigger, but more crowded. And she had her own way of finding things. And when Emerson bought Pickering or something, we had, and Calaveras, some of the Calaveras, he called him and said, I have an agreement, 1907 or something, it's between this so-and-so, it's a land-only sale, and could you find it? And Ella said, she reached down in the box, not look and could pull it out. She knew where everything was. But they had one fellow in ACF, he was a history buff, and he figured we were in the business for 100 years, because he'd count my grandfather looked at trees, or he looked at something, and my dad at that time, but so it was over 100 years when you count my dad's time and now it's getting to be I'm almost able to do that all by myself.
Get to 100 years?
Yeah.
But no, we're one of the oldest community consulting forestry groups, and there's one back in Maine. They've been in it a long time too. But they're probably profitable. We're not in that group. Johnsondale, this was 1947, 48. We're just starting up. American Forest Products it became Mount Whitney Lumber Company, and they were wanting to get a position with the Forest Service in that area, and there was the private timber was most of it was Michigan money. People had come out from Michigan, but they had no mills. They were just timber owners and bankers and stuff. And so my dad was trying to arrange where the timber from the private timber could be under contract to the Forest Service. And so that was when Johnsondale started. In fact, just a side, my brother, when he got married, went down to Rhodes Inn, and Rhodes Inn was the Rhodes Inn, and that was where they embarked to go look up Johnsondale. There was no road up there. When 1936, when he got married. Anyway, that became another part of, I did cruising down at Johnsondale too. It was a long drive from McCallum Hill, but cruising private timber that the Forest Service wanted cutting contracts on. And so that was where we had joint cruises with the Forest Service, and another company, Dwyer Rucker, owned the Sierra timber, but they also, it just happened that there were big trees on it. They were spotted, but there wasn't a solid grove. There were little groves of the sequoia intermingled with the commercial species. And so the Forest Service wanting that land. They didn't want the big trees exactly, but they wanted the whitewoods, and so that's where that's what I was down doing that too. But at the same time, I was doing this up there. I was traveling quite a bit. And that was 48, and then I started going up to Humboldt County at the same time. We managed timber property, and there was a lot of. In this period, it was a transition for the timber industry in California. Before the war, they were all sort of fixed in their ways. They had the old cruises, and they didn't need much information. The timber, a lot of it was not on the assessor's rolls. Douglas fir was not on the rolls, and so if they weren't on the rolls, then people didn't like it so much. I mean, they weren't cutting Douglas fir, the white fir. The white fir was too inaccessible because it was up on the slopes of Mount Shasta or somewhere out of the high country, and so it wasn't until after the war and that they actually put the Douglas fir on the rolls in Humboldt County, which was amazing, and other Forest Service sales in the whitewoods, the white fir, they required you to log it, and this was down the southern part of the state, and when you got off the Forest Service land, you can dump it then. They would sell them the white fir and they'd dump it and just throw it away. And that was the way they felt about white fir. It wasn't until after the war where people realized, well, white fir is pretty good too. It might smell a little differently, but it became merchantable. Before the war, it was not merchantable. And Douglas fir was barely merchantable. The change and if it wasn't on the rolls in when in 1913, when they have the income tax, everything became taxable. Redwood was put on the rolls at $3, and white fir or Douglas fir was at $1. And land was at $10 or $20 an acre, depending. And so it was actually not putting any value on the timber at all. And so that's the situation. Well, like the University Hill Foundation University Hill was a charitable, a Catholic charity. And when the property, it was all up in South Fork Mountain, up in Humboldt and Trinity County. It was all virgin, and it was owned by different people. But they donated it to University Hill, and University Hill was a Loyola University down in Los Angeles, and they hired us to manage the 13,000 acres. So that was, and so we managed that for about 15 years when it was sold. And we conducted sales, timber sales, off of it, and we cruised it. That was one of my cruises. I started cruising that, and just after I got off this other cruise, the group of, one time there was a Mexico property that they had an option on, say, 1 million or acres or some fantastic thing, and a group of Humboldt people got together and we're talking to this fellow that had this property, and they hired us. We went down and looked at it. But it's a long story. But it was a failure. And a couple of brothers that had another type of company in California, they took it on, and they lost too. That was our first venture, and it was I went down with this one accountant from Humboldt, Eureka, and they sent us and I was looking at the timber, and he looked at the books and all, and he said, "Dean, we're not going to make it." He said, well, he used other words. And I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "Have you ever been in a law office and there's not a law book in sight?" And he was right. And they would say, "Well, you do it this way. You have one pile for this person, one pile for this. That's where you did your money." And so that was one Mexico trip, and that lasted a couple of years. I had a couple of trips to Acapulco. We went to Brazil when Ludwig was cutting all to make a plywood stuff, and that was just 2 weeks out of my life. And then we didn't agree, or he didn't like the way we did it, and he did his own way, and then the government took it from him. We did not invest any money in anything. We did it for hire, and we didn't buy land. We might have had the opportunity, but we didn't buy it. Like one time we formed this company, and it was we had a banker and an accountant, and my brother and I, and compadres de San Antonio is what we called ourselves. And we bought some land, but we did not develop it. And our last purchase was 2,000 acres up in Willow, the town of Willows. It was all cut over, and then we sold it. And probably that was the one we should have just said, let it grow. Well, I was cruising timber up there, and the Redwood Association hired me to help on this Redwood Park. But we worked for Pacific Lumber and Simpson Timber, and we cruised all their properties, and so. And before the war and right after the war, the Redwood timber, there was only about 9 companies. They're all large companies, starting out in Santa Cruz, going up to Mendocino. There was one in Sonoma County, a couple in Fort Bragg, and Pacific Lumber, and a couple in Eureka, and a couple up in Mendocino, Crescent City. And that was the redwood industry. It was just and so they were sort of exposed to any acquisitions by them. And so they formed this California Redwood Association, I think. Got them together to demonstrate why they should not lose their property to the public. And so and then there was a question of volumes and all that, redwood volume. And they hired me to work with them, and they hired 2 consultants, Samuel Dana, was a Michigan professor. He was 80 years old. And the California, or the Redwood American Forestry Association had Ken Pomeroy. Do you know that name, mate? Well, he was their chief forester, and I did work with him in setting up volumes, redwood volumes, setting up my idea what the volumes were. And so he was hired, and so they had those two, Pomeroy and Sam Dana, and they hired me asked me to be their guide, and so. And this happened in 1964. They were fighting. They really wanted to save their lands, and they were worried about all the environmentalists and all that. And so I met Samuel Dana. He was a Michigan professor, and he was very prominent then as a very public, and he was 80 years old. And he met me with the chief forester, Kenneth Pomeroy, and I became their guide. So we took him to Pacific Lumber, took him out and showed him their property first. And then the next day, and all the lumber companies were giving them the red carpet, and I was guiding them. And then we went to Simpson. They all had a little demonstration for us, and they would talk. That's where we'd talk to them, and they would tell Sam Dana and Chief Forester what their plans were, and so the forester for PL did his work, and then next day we went to Simpson. They had one demonstration, and then we moved up to Del Norte County, and saw Miller and all the owners up there, and then demonstration, and then we came back down, and I think then we went to Arcata Redwood. I don't remember that property where they've had their demonstration for, but they clear-cut an area right when the Highway 101 going north, looks right at it. And it was a wonderful job because they replanted it. It was beautiful, except it looked like hell. And the forester was so proud of it. And Sam Dana said, "Take it down, don't show that anymore, throw it away." And he was very frank. And so then we got to the Eureka Inn. They had saved the Redwood League. The local resident had a suite on the third floor of the Eureka Inn, and so they had a cocktail party for us. Dean and Sam and Mrs. Dana, I suppose you remember, she was tagged along, and she was a brilliant little old gal. She was a supervisor in Ann Arbor County, or wherever it is, back where Michigan is. And so she was long, and she always had something to say. And so we went up to this cocktail party, and they had crab. And I don't think Sam Dana had ever tasted crab. And he started eating it, and he just ate it, and he loved it. They all loved it. This is up in the third floor. And so we went down to dinner, and Sam ordered crab. After all that, that was funny. Pomeroy was going to write an article about saving the redwoods and what had already been saved. And so that was what he was supposed to add strength to a private person saying, "You ought to do this." when everybody else said you save them. And private timber owners wanted to demonstrate that they were good managers of their resource. And this is what it, because we're letting the public in, and but we're using it. The public could be in allowed one area, and then they couldn't go in the other part, and then when the other part was ready, they'd go. That was the idea, rotating the public around, but still keeping it in private ownership. I don't know whether it probably is that they demonstrated that they were fighting a losing battle, and redwood industry, they never were fighting for themselves. There's different factions, and that's when the Redwood Association was trying to do. They wouldn't let you see what their books are. They were competing against each other. And what the Redwood Association is doing a good job of trying to get an association output out of it. And they did a good job. I got involved in it because I wrote an article for a journal and stated how much what the volume of redwoods. It was my estimate, but I was just taking other people's estimate and there's a couple of paragraphs, and it showed the volumes of redwood. And that was that's how I got involved, because the American Forestry Association picked that up. And it was a losing battle all the way. But I developed the volume tables for the first take, and also the second take. I was hired by the attorneys to represent all of them, and I represented mainly Simpson. But I sat in all the meetings and all of it. And I went and testified in '64 back at Senator Udall's. And that reminds me of Mrs. Dana, when we went and looked at the big tall trees that GP had. Hammond had it, and then GP. And this was in December. It was about December 10th or something, maybe a little later. And we went down and looked at the tall trees. And at that time, the access to the tall trees was from the Arcata Redwood side, or GP side, and Arcata Redwood on the north side of the Redwood Creek. And so we could drive down a logging road and looked across the river, or Redwood Creek, and saw the redwoods, and they weren't impressed by it because it was not a good view. I don't know whether you ever looked at them, but you don't see how tall they are, because they're just a bunch of trees there, and the tops hanging over. But after that, we turned around and started back up this logging road, and it was been raining like the dough, and it was hard. It was really raining, and water was coming out through this virgin timber we were going through, just like a river coming off the banks. And Mrs. Dana said, "I wonder what Senator Udall is doing at this moment." So then they went back and they did their thing. And so that my involvement of the redwoods has not stopped, and I'm still doing work from the redwoods.
Good.
Making estimates and stuff.
Yep. You're still active?
Well, I'm active. I'm still doing work, some of it not being paid for it now. But I have never retired, but I just ran out of clients. Advice, I'd say to watch it. The situation has changed. It all happened with the environmental thing. We just, I don't know if it's accurate, but when we first started, we were hiring people that, a lot of them from companies that Simpson had purchased, but just anybody that wanted to was graduate from school. They would not get very much money when they started with the state or the Forest Service, but they soon surpassed that. And the private people never did get that increase. There's like, well, Bill's an example of it. Now he's working as a retirement. But I don't know what Jim Abel said to you, but he's got himself. He's more like a public forester almost. The way I don't know how he handles himself, but I think he's very capable, and he's got a few clients that keep him going. I mean, permanent thing, but there's really no future for a private forester. With private forestry might not be in existence 10 years from now. But if you can get on with get experience in the private industry and then transfer into public forestry, or a lot of the people getting forestry degrees never practice forestry, never go to forestry. They got a job somewhere else. So my advice is be very careful. And I was very, very fortunate to have my situation was built in for someone to be. And I was doing things that normally you would be 20 years down the road before you'd get a job like that. I could sit at the table with the chief forester because I was the only guy there and doing things. It's getting to be tough to be in the private industry, and whether you're a producer or a forester. Like Pacific Lumber is not a good example of what happens, but here is this old company, privately owned. And they're now they're privately owned, but not by them, and they're a totally different company. And all of the companies are Simpson is selling all they don't have any sawmills hardly anymore. They're selling what they have down here in California. They want to get out of the business, and I think eventually it's going to be more of a government-controlled type of industry. Maybe I don't know if that's the right way of saying it, but it's. I would not advise anybody to go in the timber business. Before when they had I don't think this was a society. Maybe it was a limb of the society when the Amador, Eldorado, Calaveras group, the lumber people and the forestry people got together once a month, and someone would say, "Who's going to buy the wine?" And so that was how they all got together, and they had plenty of wine or whatever stuff they were drinking, and they had good program, good, and that's I was chairman of that once before I went to Cal, before became an SAF guy, I was secretary of that group, but I was not eligible to be a SAF, but we had SAF meetings. It was a place where they didn't recognize that it was not timber. It was sort of a hunting ranch and cattle ranch. They had some timber on it, and three investors from Humboldt County interested Pacific Lumber in investing in buying the timber rights to this property. It was 650,000 acres or more, and they hired us to manage this timber property, and so we had my brother's son, Frank Solinsky IV, went down there, and he was the local manager, and then not the timber, and he and his wife, and he saw to the cutting. They had a little cutting going on, and he hired Bill to be his leg man, forester, and all. And Bill, Frank was not much older than Bill, but they did a good job down there, and I think Frank wore out a couple of cars driving. You had to drive about 100 miles before they could even start thinking about the trees. And so it was mostly in the car or pickup. The ranch had some beautiful animals on it. There were elk and some deer, big deer, and they didn't get any buffalo, but we were getting some elk from the Yellowstone. Whatever elk they had up there, they would buy them, bring them down, turn them loose on their big property, and then they would have elk hunting and all. And then cutting the trees became an afterthought, and it was fairly successful, but not too successful, and it was beautiful country, and you didn't get snowbound, but Frank went down there on September 30th. I remember the date. It was. They said it doesn't snow much there, but it snowed several feet, and they were snowbound for about a week. And the bad part about that, I was on a New Mexico property exactly the year before, at 8,000 feet or 10,000 or so, and I got snowbound for a week on September 30th. I remember those two dates well. But how long were you there?
I was just there for the summer.
Yeah.
And but we would cruise right up to the timberline.
Yeah.
And lightning would be striking below us. And one story was on a Friday, the cattle crew, was going to town, noticed a fire was burning, but didn't call it in because that would ruin their weekend. And so by Monday, that's when I got my first firefighting experience.
The arbitration, that was private. One private shipping company was in arbitration with St. Regis Paper Company, and they got into a fight they decided on arbitration, and so they selected a fellow from Seattle who was a forester, and he was selected by the, he represented the lawyer. We had a retired judge who was going to be on the undertook, and he was representing Bob Kleiner, who was a consulting forester out of Eureka, or he died. But his son is still, he was selected by St. Regis, and I was selected by the logging company. And the three of us met, and then with four of us, and we traveled all over the properties, and we had witnesses, and they were all under sworn. They were sworn witnesses of different, whether they were mill operators or foresters or game hunters or whatever, and we had information from everybody, and we had 64 days of hearing, actual hearing where we met, and then we had 18 days of deliberation before we made our opinion, and that was really historic, and because it cost them a lot of money. It's not a cheap way to do it, and one thing it was a fun place. It took over 2 years to do this. We had they had decided who would, the lumber company and the logging company didn't want one side to be ahead of the other one. So, like when we had one would bring lunch, or one would do it. So we had one picnic above the fog, and we sat up on this mountain and looking out, and we saw Mount St. Helens before it lost its top, Mount Rainier, and Mount Hood, the three mountains, peaks coming out of the fog. It was quite a sight to see that, and that was. I don't think no one is going to see that again. We made an award. They had to change the logging practice, and there was a fine of several million, maybe $20 million or something. I forget now what it was, but to show what they did was they rented an apartment for Bob Kleiner, because he was an out-of-stater, and an apartment for me. We had our own apartment, like this size, and we had that for 64 days. When we were cruising Simpson in 1956, 57, we were cruising all their lands that they had acquired, and we were finishing the Del Norte lands, and the last day, our timber cruiser was going to fly. He had a little private plane, and my nephew Frank was up there helping him, and so they took all the cruise notes and put them in the plane, and Frank had a pickup up there, and he took that home, and Floyd was in his plane, and he flew down from Del Norte County, and he got off at Fort Bragg, and it was raining and stuff, and there was a fisherman's village where a fellow lived, and he said he heard the plane making noises, and all of a sudden come straight out of the clouds, and he had no chance to pull up, and he went into the ocean, got killed. And we lost all the notes and all. We had to re-cruise that whole area again. It was about a 3 or 4 weeks cruise notes. So it took a long time for him to find it. And,
Well, Frank didn't fly because he was bringing down burros in the back of his truck.
yeah, Frank, we got loaded up. They were finding burros. They were nerds, really. It was not a real burrow. It was a knurl, and it didn't go into the ground. But you see these big redwood trees with a big wart on it. That was what that nerd is, knurl.
Neural.
And we cut one up, and I still have it over in Mike's house. Well, the Murphys were one part of the old starting Pacific Lumber, not a couple hundred years, but a long time ago. And the board of directors, well, I don't know where I should say it out of turn, but the board was instructed to fight any acquisition attempt by anybody. And they geared themselves to fight that off. And I was on that one committee to do everything you can to prevent this happening. But somehow or another, and no one really knows why, but the board, a certain group of them, capitulated and gave in to this offer. And so then that was done by that, and you couldn't fight it. And then it was a slow, old growth company, and they were very, they didn't move very fast, but they were good operators. But they didn't move fast enough for people who wanted to make more money. And I think this.
As far as not using up their resource, the old growth the old growth redwood, they wanted to keep for a longer time, but the other companies didn't.
But they had this one block of timber. About 3,000 acres of good old growth redwood, and I was with the board of directors. And it was some kind of meeting, and we were looking right at the headwaters. See, they call it the headwaters. But we're right on their headwaters, and that timber was planned on. They were going to log it soon, but Hurwitz made it faster. He bought it. He bought the whole thing, and sold it to the government. And Eureka is getting now. They have the Headwaters Fund, and they're getting out of that $20 million or whatever it was. Oh, that was our main business, was capital gains. And that's when our company could, if they had a gain or a loss, that's where that loss. The case of a lumber company that owned the timber in 1913, it has when they had that Act of 1913, their timber became worth $3 a thousand. And then when the park came in, or whenever they wanted to sell that, the redwood, they were selling it for several $100s, and so they would have a gain of $300 to $500 or whatever. So several $100 gain, which then you could, that's taxed differently than other. And so that was where mainly a lot of these old companies, where the only money they made was from capital gains. And in any business, I guess that's the case. If you got a gain, why then, why that's good, and even if it's on paper, because you can use that gain. So that was what, and every year, I did a whole lot of it, because looking at my diary, there's 4 or 5 calls in one day or something about capital, and I'd set the values. And so this is timber that's not being cut, but you have a value, and I'd say it's worth so much, and they'd sell it to them to whatever, but they would only have to pay tax on a little bit of it. The rest of it would be a capital gains tax, which is a lower tax. That was some, I didn't know whether you wanted to get into that. It was the Native Indian Act, Native Person Act, where the natives, the Native Indians, not the Eskimos, came under this act, and the Congress made a deal where if a Native person lost money, he could sell it for capital gains for some, and so these natives would like want to build a pulp plant, or they make a plywood plant, or do something large expenditure of money, and they'd suffer a big loss, like several $1 million to more. And so they would go have that and document this loss, and then they could sell that. And so like United Airlines would be buying stock, buying a loss, or the large companies in the United States were buying losses to and making the Indian whole, or the natives whole, but they would make themselves whole by their taxes would be reduced, and they would make money on that. Well, not Della Van Lovenzel.
Yeah, that's precedent.
When a person like you'd have your tax on your land, or if you're going to sell it, but if you own it, you could get the capital gain. You'd have to set a value for what you're selling. And in case of Della Van Lovensel's, and she was a interesting old lady, but and I set her fair values for her timber that she was cutting, and to get it to her base, why you'd say, because it's an undivided interest, that's a discount. A discount, undivided interest, say, of a property of $1 is not worth $1. It's worth maybe a fraction of that. And so
because you can't control the property.
Well, yeah, and so in Della's case, well, everybody was using like a capital gain discount of 40% or 50% or something, whatever. And so I put a discount of 40%, which that's really times 6.6. That's 40, and Della's, paid her taxes, and she said my timber was worth less than 60% of what it was. And so that was our capital gain. And the government said, no, it's not worth that. You should only do it about 20%. That's a proper. And so I went to court. And lo and behold, Della got away with that 40% discount, and it was, the government was so mad about that. Oh, they hated
The IRS.
the IRS because they were challenged of, they always were trying to get that discount. Should not be such a deep discount, and I agree it shouldn't have been, but underwriting is a real discount when you have got a family arguing about what its value is something, and they can't agree, and so it isn't worth a dollar. Isn't worth a dollar when you have 4 or 5 people owning that dollar, and so Della, I think, is still and Della was her defense is. They said she was an old lady. Well, she was 95, and she took out a 10-year contract. She bought something on a 10-year basis or something, so that she expected to live for 10 years, and she did live to be over 100, but that made the books, tax books, and I was pretty proud of that. I was part of it.